the rising tide really did lift all boats. I mean, the amount of poverty reduction we saw in America and across the world because of these ideas is very true, right? But one thing I think we forgot to do was look over our shoulder and say, hey, are we really bringing everybody along with us? And, the new right's call to look at these hollowed out steel towns, these manufacturing towns, these people.
My guest today is Peter Lipsett. Peter is the vice president at Donors Trust and host of its Giving Ventures podcast. Peter recently completed an 11-episode series with the topic of What is the Right, exploring what the modern conservative movement, the modern right, looks like, its different contours, the changes that we've seen since President Reagan's presidency. And he joins me today for a podcast about his podcast. So, Peter, thanks for being here.
It's very meta. It's great to have that big conversation with you, Dan.
Absolutely. You've interviewed 21 leaders on the right, and so now I'm going to put you in the interview chair for the next few minutes. So let's just begin with the topic of the podcast. You asked the question, what is the right? After 11 episodes, do you have an answer to that question? What is the right today? What are the philosophical or political ideas and ideals that hold the right together?
Yeah, so the right's a little diluted, a little more diluted than it was. I don't think that's a surprise necessarily to anybody listening. This fusionism idea that really drove the right for a very long time, particularly, starting in the 70s, but really in the 80s and into the 90s, was the idea. We kind of defined conservatism pretty well. And you had your social conservatives, and you had your more libertarian conservatives, and kind of your traditionalists, and your more pragmatists, but it still was pretty cohesive. And, the whole impetus for the podcast came about really because I was sitting at the Freedom Conservative Conference last February. I believe you were there as well. And it occurred to me while I was sitting there, why do we need a conference for these ideas? These are the conservative ideas. And realized my own myopic view had kind of allowed the world to shift without me really paying attention to it. And you had this emergence of the national conservatives and the new right. Frankly, I didn't even know what traditionalism was and what that strand of conservatism looked like until we got into the podcast series. The religious side has shifted a bit under the Trump era. And so there's been a lot going on, and I realized, I really should explore this and unpack this. And I felt like we at Donors Trust were a good platform to do that because we view ourselves as a big tent, our arm of the conservative movement of the right with the philanthropists that we work with, libertarians and conservatives and evangelicals and Jewish givers and all across the board. And so wanted to scratch that itch and figure out, okay, what is this landscape now, and is there a cohesive narrative, and what is it going to look like in the future?
So what are the underlying ideas that hold the right together right now? The idea of an American right, the way that we understand it in the back half of the 20th century, is still relatively new. Lionel Trilling famously said in 1950 that there were no conservative ideas in America in general circulation. That to the extent that there were conservatives, they were just expressing irritable mental gestures seeking to resemble ideas. And 15 years after he said that, it was clear that there was a real conservative movement in America with its own magazines and think tanks and intellectual institutions and the rest of it. So, in 2025, what are the underlying ideas that still hold all of the different parts of the conservative movement together?
Well, if it was all holding together really well, then maybe we wouldn't need the podcast series. But as I mentioned earlier, the fusionism idea is still very important. And from that, you can take the freedom conservatives, you can take some piece of the traditionalist arm, and obviously the libertarian arm. But what you have now is this emergence of the national conservatives, which you can also call the new right, but sometimes the new right views itself differently than national conservatism. That was a whole rabbit hole that I really had to unpack and learn more about. Traditionalists kind of skew that way. The Catholic conservatives have kind of split between your mainline libertarian economic-oriented ones, like your Acton Institute types, versus your Catholic integralists, which I don't think is a huge percentage, but it's a very vocal percentage, and they align more with that new right piece. And then there's these other people who are kind of the right, but don't fit neatly in a box, right? Is Barry Weiss part of the right now? I mean, she certainly says things that a lot of people on the right would agree with, but I have many people who are like, no, she's absolutely not part of the right. But we agree with her more than certainly our progressive friends do, or Jordan Peterson or Rob Henderson, these types of people. So those are probably the three big buckets: kind of fusionism, free con type, the new right, national conservatism, and then other. The defectors, the something else who are pushing back against this woke ideology, but don't fit neatly into a box. And we can go down all those rabbit holes, but that kind of gives a big picture view of the fracture.
Yeah, it seems like you can almost say that there are certain things that all of the different factions that you identify on the right agree that they're against, but there's a different question as to what it is that they're for. And just to take one particular example, the libertarian and fusionist wing of the conservative movement would traditionally be very skeptical about government intervention, especially federal government intervention into the economy, into civil society, whereas a lot of the new right and national conservative trends are much more not just accepting, but enthusiastic about using the levers of public power to advance their vision of a good society. Is that a fair articulation of that?
I think that's really the crux of a lot of it, is this question of what do you do with power? Because inarguably, the right, however you want to define it, has power right now, right? I mean, Trump is of the right. Congress is of the right. Even the Supreme Court is kind of the right. A lot of governors are of the right. And you can color in with different shades across that board. But okay, so if the right has power, what are we going to do with it? And you're right. The kind of new right, national conservative side has a more forceful, let's use the powers that have been used against us to get our ideas out there, versus what I kind of see a little bit more on the freedom conservative side of, we still want some of those same things, but we want to bring other people along with us. We want to actually build a coalition of people so that it all doesn't fall apart down the road when powers change, when the winds change. You actually want to build something that's going to last. And to me, I think that's one of the, what are you going to do with the power? How forceful are you going to be with it? Really is the defining question, certainly the defining political question of the right, because that's, I think, where a lot of the tension really lies.
So one of the reasons I really liked your podcast series is because it felt like we were kind of learning along with you. I think you did an admirable job of asking questions that brought out kind of the best version of the views that all of your different expositors had. I'm curious, as you went through these interviews, as you went through this podcast, what was it that surprised you the most? What did you learn? What did you find that you weren't expecting going into this project?
Frankly, I mean, to put my priors on the table, I didn't expect to find not alignment, but maybe sympathy or empathy of the new right position more than I did. And here was kind of my fundamental big takeaway that in the last episode I kind of put to our guests Yuval Levin and Chris DeMuth, and they said that I was largely on track with this. So that essentially the fusionist, where the fracture really came from is that the fusionist idea was rolling along really well. You know, the traditionalists, the libertarians, everybody was happy by and large. And, you know, we were making real progress. And over time, the libertarian wing got more out front. And we took as gospel things like free markets and free trade and those types of things, to the point that we were almost saying them without even having to define them. And eventually got out over our skis.
Yeah, it's John Stuart Mill's idea of the dead dogma. You just repeat the view, and if you can't actually articulate it, defend it, build it anew, you don't truly understand it.
Right, and it was working. The rising tide really did lift all boats. I mean, the amount of poverty reduction we saw in America and across the world because of these ideas is very true, right? But one thing I think we forgot to do was look over our shoulder and say, hey, are we really bringing everybody along with us? And, you know, the new right's call to look at these hollowed out steel towns, these manufacturing towns, these people that are being left behind, rightfully and truly. what are we going to do about them? And that's not necessarily a call to government intervention, but it is a call to something. The community stepping up, having better answers that aren't just, well, free markets will eventually fix it. Eventually isn't good enough, particularly in a political world. And I think the fusionist idea ultimately wasn't able to answer that in a satisfactory way that led to the rise of the national conservatism. Now, I think some of the solutions of national conservatism, New Right, go too far and are too prescriptive. And I do wonder how can you remarry some of those ideas versus using government power, which again we've got now, to kind of hammer home some kind of solution. So that was probably my biggest surprise is the New Right does have something to say, which I know sounds trite. Anybody from that position will be like, of course we do. We are the new conservatives now. But we shouldn't abandon the freedom conservative libertarian ideas that have done so much good. We have to find a way to remarry them.
So this is the Reaganism podcast. And of course, the specter of President Reagan looms really large in any debate that people are having about the conservative movement. The national conservatives have been aggressive in denouncing zombie Reaganism, the view that a continuation of President Reagan's values, ideas, and public policies is anathema to what America needs right now. This idea of the dead consensus, they've been very aggressive in proselytizing against it. At the same time, though, when poll after poll of Republican voters shows that President Reagan is still the most popular president among voters on the right, everyone still has a Reagan Award, a Reagan dinner. The Project from Americans for Prosperity, from Americans for Tax Reform, to name something in every state in the District of Columbia after President Reagan still has steam behind it. So I'm curious, what's your view after having gone through this exploration as to where President Reagan stands within the conservative movement today, and are there real fissures between the different groups, the different tribes on the right regarding President Reagan's legacy and his image among conservative intellectuals and politicos and activists?
Certainly among the more fusionist-friendly, freedom conservative types, the pro-Reagan image is still there. There's a lot of people who look at him as the spokesman for those ideas. But I mean, you're right. In my New Right podcast, and I feel like even in some of the other episodes, there was this kind of skepticism of Reagan. And, I wonder if a lot of that comes back just, yes, there's stated disagreement on some of the policies or the way things are, but if it's really a matter of style, I wonder if some people just think Reagan was too nice. He managed to do a lot of these things, advance a lot of these ideas, but also in this friendly, not allowing himself to be rolled over. Obviously, he was always very firm in what he believed, but he was firm in a way that actually brought people to his side. That is not the political tenor that we have now. It's I want this and I'm going to get it done. And so that style piece, I think, is the piece that's overlooked when we're talking about this. And can you actually attract more people with honey instead of vinegar? And honey was what Reagan always offered. So I don't know. I think we should have a little more discussion about that and what that can do to win people over versus just the ideas.
So I want to talk more about that because I think that that's a really important point. I'm curious as to, in your estimation, how much of the New Right is really a question of vibe and affect rather than new policy ideas. So the policy critique that will come from a lot of people on the fusionist or freedom conservative or Reaganist right is that the New Right is mostly about vibe. It's mostly about affect. There's a lot of slogans associated with it, accompanied with kind of left-wing economic policy ideas. To what extent are these debates between these different tribes really substantive matters of ideology, philosophy, policy versus this vibe question?
I think vibe may take it too far, but I definitely think it's a difference in style. It's a difference of speed, of how fast are we going to do these things, and a difference of just, this is trite, but like respect for the other side, right? We don't have to agree with anything the other side said, but they're still there. They're still a force. And we can either pretend that they are not there and just try to steamroll them, which we frankly have the levers to be able to do, or we can try to bring people to our side. And again, I think that's where Reagan really excelled. I think that's where the movement actually excelled for a while. I think Bush, the second Bush W, tried to do that some as well. And certainly he had things working in his favor in terms of post 9/11, kind of a general sense of people coming together. The Cold War brought people together. Right now, we don't have one of those big issues to help bring people together. And I am not calling for some national tragedy that's going to do that. But, it'd be nice to find some means to be able to talk to each other in a smoother, nicer way without a national tragedy. But I do think the styles are just so different.
So I'm curious as to your thoughts. To what extent is this debate about the future of the right that we're having right now truly something that's new versus something that has been an undercurrent of the conservative movement for the last 75 years? It's definitely a through line of American conservatism and of most political movements that there are different reconsolidations, that groups enter the fray, that groups leave, that groups raise in status and prominence and power, other groups lower. Do you see this as a continuation, or has there been a real break, a real fracture within the American center-right over the course of the last decade or so?
Yeah, the one guest that I didn't get to have for scheduling reasons was Matt Continetti, who of course wrote the book The Right, which, nerd that I am, I read at the beach a couple years ago. It was great page-turning stuff if you really like that kind of history. And it is a good reminder that the right has shifted and fractured and brought in some crazy people over time. Huey Long was kind of part of the right in early days, and not somebody we would necessarily want in there now. So to what extent is this different than all that? I don't know. I think we're probably biased by the fact that really since the 80s, there's been a relative calm within the right. It's been fairly cohesive, even as the left, the Democrats have shifted in a lot of different ways. But now I really do struggle with this. Like, is this a fracture that's just that much different than the past, or is our memory just too short? And I think it is much bigger fracture than has been happening in the last 40 years, but it is not something that's so unovercomable based on history that we can't be optimistic that we can come back together in some way.
I mean, it seems that one of the through lines from your interviews, it came up in almost all of them, is this question about the nature of the founding. And it seems that there are two different strands of thought within the right today. So one is the kind of traditional fusionist view of the founding as something that is unique to the United States, possibly divinely inspired, that the founding represents a singular moment, not just in the history of the United States, but in the history of the world. It was what gave birth to the American exceptionalism that many of us have believed has pervaded our country for 250 years now. But there is a strand of thought within the right that I'm not sure would have been at home with the right at any time in the past that rejects the American founding in a fairly explicit way, including the strictures and structure of the Constitution. It strikes me that those two views can't really exist within the same movement, at least over the long term. What's your view on that, or am I over-intellectualizing this? Is this the kind of thing that people in Washington and in the academy like to think about, but it has nothing to do with actual public policy? It has nothing to do with actually getting to 51% coalitions?
Yeah, this is a bit more theory than fact, but my take is that it's probably a factor of the fact that the new right is poking and prodding and trying to find where it can create something new, right? I mean, my hope is that ultimately that the National Conservative side will listen to its traditionalist wing a bit, and that says, Western civilization actually is a pretty big deal. The Judeo-Christian principles are a pretty big deal. And they say that part, but then they seem to reject other pieces of it as you're articulating. I think that's going to come out in the wash eventually. It seems to be just some experimentation of, what if we say this? What if we try to reject the Constitution because we need power now? Again, it goes back to that question of power. And if you are taking that long view, as conservatives are meant to do, and believing that that Chesterton fence shouldn't be knocked down without really questioning it deeply, if you're just going to run at it and say that fence is in the way, which is frankly what a lot of the people who are on the more political side of the new right do, then yeah, you're going to knock down the Constitution because it's in the way. But I think the more intellectual elements are probably going to steer that, course correct that a little bit more. And, frankly, some of that comes from the top and these people who are, quote unquote, just asking questions.
So moving back beyond some of the policy disagreements, I'm wondering, to what extent did you see articulated in all of your interviews and in your general engagement with the right, is there a clear view of what a good society looks like, of what we should be aiming for, either in terms of specifics or in terms of these sort of pluralist institutions that will allow that to emerge? And I ask this because I think, in addition to the question of the founding, there is a divide on the right between as to what a good society looks like. I'm wondering, are there enough commonalities between the different factions on the right to re-knit together a clear path going forward? Or is it primarily defined, or are the things that hold the right together in terms of the good society opposition to leftist dogma and wokeness?
Certainly that ties a lot together, right? It's we are not them, and that is an insufficient platform for governing. Certainly, it may win you a few elections, but it doesn't help in the long run. One of the weird tensions is that on the more freedom conservative side, you hear a lot more talk about progress and technology, and it could be mistaken for a more progressive party, if you will. Yeah, but it's all grounded in, again, going back to the Chesterton fence and the Constitution. Like, it's grounded in these principles that then allow progress to happen. Versus on the more national conservative side, there seems to be this nostalgia for a 1950s America that may or may not have actually existed. There's a new piece in the Dispatch from Kevin Williamson that explores this, that I have open on my computer. I'm eager to read, because he's going to, I believe, unpack this idea of this nostalgia that's not really there, and yet they're trying to push down all these obstacles to get back to that past, and almost seem stuck in a past that may or may not have existed. So that's another one of the tensions of which history are we really going? How far back in history do we really want to go to create what that is? And I think that's something that has to be reconciled. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but
yeah. I think so. So you talked about a lot of different groups as part of this. One group that I saw that's obviously really influential in right of center politics today that you didn't have an explicit episode on was the tech right. So I'm interested, what are your thoughts on the emergence of the tech right onto the American conservative scene? Do you think that this is going to be a long-term part of the right of center coalition? Or are we likely to resume some version of the status quo ante here, where the tech world is kind of embraces somewhat progressive vibes and left of center politics, but generally tries to stay out of the workings of Washington and to stay out of politics, except to the extent that's necessary for defensive purposes?
Yeah, I think this is an important question. And so the episode called The Defectors, which is that episode where I explore this bucket of others. And the tech right is, we touch on a little bit there, your people like Mark Andreessen or Balaji, right? Where do they fit? Again, a lot of what they're saying right now, even Mark Zuckerberg sometimes, sound like they're of the right. They're certainly leveraging the power of the right, but are they going to stay there? And that conversation was with John Popola, who is a keen observer of this, has talked to a lot of folks over at Emergent Order Foundation and his Dad Saves America podcast. And, our kind of consensus was mixed, is they're going to go where the political winds take them. I think they are seeing, I think the most important win there is that they are indeed seeing the dangers of the woke right and what it can do to undermine technology. The challenge, I think, of ultimately getting to some kind of new fusionism that may include them is they are more part of that libertarian wing that's always looking forward, never looking back over its shoulder to make sure they're bringing everybody along. They're just assuming people are following. And whether that ultimately gets them kind of pushed out or helps them be leaders in this, I think is one of the big questions that we're going to have to watch. But I do think we need to invite them in and say, hey, you believe in progress. This is why we believe in progress. Here's the conservative ideas that support a belief towards progress. Do you believe those too? Do you want to learn more about those? And try to get more of that tech right to understand not just the political ends, but the ideological underpinnings of it all.
You mentioned the traditionalists earlier, and I thought that was one of the most fun episodes of this series. And it would be the traditionalists that I would see as kind of being most likely to object to a lot of what the tech right brings to the table. Talk a little bit more about who the traditionalists are among the conservative coalition. I feel like they get the least print of all of the different groups that are represented. But talk a little bit about who they are and the role that they've played traditionally in the conservative coalition.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, this was the group that I didn't even really know existed prior to doing this, and yet have really come to understand they are half of the fusionist idea. They really are, to a certain extent, this probably oversimplifies it, but kind of the keeper of the flame for the Western civilization, Judeo-Christian idea. They're less about politics. They're less about power. They're more about the ideas. These are our more bookish friends across the conservative movement, right? And they are really, really important for, like I said, keeping the flame. Even now, having done the episode, I don't feel like I can do them justice, but I do certainly have a new respect for them. But the interesting thing about that group is there is a certain wing of it that's a little bit more Catholic integralist that does kind of steer towards that new right, partially because of those folks that got left behind. A feeling that a society needs to answer for that kind of sin of not allowing space for everybody to really come along in the prosperity gains. And their call is, again, less political. The traditionalists advocate more community, more family. You see a lot more conversation of that in the National Conservative dialogue than you do even in the Freedom Conservative dialogue. I think that's important. I think those are one of those unsaid things that we talk about, right? When we conservatives talk about the importance of the individual and the freedoms of the individual, we fail to say the quiet part, which is so that we can interact in our communities and have the families we want and do these things. The progressive side does the opposite. They say community is the most important thing. Why? So that the individual can prosper. They don't say that part. And so we're kind of after the same thing, but we need to remember that it's not just the individual, it's the community too. So that was one of the big takeaways I got from the traditionalist piece.
And of course, they were a big part of President Reagan's coalition, and a lot of their ideas animated a lot of what the president did and said. His 1985 CPAC speech, he talks about how the biggest triumph of conservatism after his first term was that what he referred to as the normal Americans are no longer on the defense from the left, and the idea that people could go about their lives, live in their communities, attend church, educate their children how they wanted, that was no longer a culturally retrograde position, that they were not being attacked by the left for doing that. That was a big victory of his coalition. And it seems like there's echoes of that today, 40 years later.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So, Peter, you're a baseball fan, so you know Yogi Berra's maxim that it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. But I'm going to ask you to do that. What would be obviously the presence of Donald Trump has been huge for American conservatism over the last decade. He has been a singular influence in a way that nobody has since President Reagan, perhaps eclipsing even him in terms of import to the building of a movement and voting blocks. So I'm interested in what your thoughts are after he leaves the White House in 2029. but not just thinking about that the 2028 election, but thinking more longer term. Where do you see the American right in 10 to 15 years? What are the overall ideas that we'll see animating American conservatism, say, in 2040? And how do those differentiate themselves? How are those different than the ideals that animated American conservatism and the American right in the past?
I tell you, Dan, it was a lot more fun in my podcast to ask that question of the guests, because then I didn't have to have the answer. So I resent the fact that I have to try to look into this crystal ball.
You have asked you've asked this question, so now you get to synthesize all of the best things that you were told.
Fair enough. So I kind of view it in different phases, right? And I know you're asking kind of the 2040 piece, but for the next 3 years are an important phase, and then you have 2029, and then some period after that. And then you're right. Then you have the real distant future. To me, those are the three different phases. The freedom conservative side, the Reaganite side, I think almost just has to struggle to survive for the next 3 years and keep its voice out there, try to build a positive consensus towards the ideas that, frankly, most people on the right actually agree with, versus just using power. Power may not be enough come the midterms next year. And you will need to bring some people along. So I think that's the near-term challenge, and we need all the groups to rise to that, particularly those on the freedom conservative side, particularly those that believe in that Reaganite vision of, hey, we can't just get silenced out. We have to keep rising. Post-Trump being off the scene, I think you either see this kind of new right coalition drifting more towards the left, finding political allies in certain issues, particularly around trade or some of those economic issues, if the left can actually come a little bit more towards the center. If they take candidates, both of us are here in Virginia. We have Abby Spanberger as our incoming governor, who I think is wildly liberal, but she certainly tried to tack to the center. I imagine you might see some more of that. And if there can be some new political coalition, you may see some of that new right shift towards finding political allies that are not with an R behind their name. Conversely, if you see things go the other direction, if the Zoran Mondani regime proves too enticing to too many young people, and AOC is on the presidential debate stage, then you may actually see a necessity for the new right and the freedom conservatives to find that common ground to create a new fusionism that will allow us to put some optimistic and hopeful ideas that don't require us to sell everything out to government. And frankly, that's kind of my hope. Not that I want to see an AOC on a debate stage, but that we find some new fusionism out of this that allows the traditionalist argument to come back to the forefront, that we look back at those Chesterton fences and maybe mend them and rebuild them, strengthen the Constitution, understand what it actually says, but still allow progress, still allow that libertarian impulse of free minds and free markets to be an important ethos of that, even as we invite other people along with it, frankly, in a more Reaganite vision. And, the one Reagan phrase that I think about a lot, we use it on our welcome boxes at Donors Trust, is that phrase that everyone listening to this has heard about freedom is only one generation away from extinction. And the important word there is generation, right? We're not going to lose it overnight. We're not going to lose it tomorrow or even with the next election. We have time to rebuild this, but it's going to take a proactive, systematic, concerted effort of saying, this is the future we really want. This is what we want the next generation to really value. And if we can come together on some of those core values and reject some of the values that are coming out of the other side, the future can be bright.
Very well said. I don't want to get out of here without giving you the opportunity to tell listeners a little bit about Donors Trust. So tell us about Donors Trust, the role that you play in the conservative movement, and where people can find out more about what you do.
Yeah, well, we think philanthropy is really important, and those of you listening who think philanthropy is important always want to do that in a simpler, more positive way, whether simpler means just easier or more private or more tax advantaged or just smarter. Donors Trust was created to really help conservative and libertarian donors to give in that smarter way. We offer a donor advised fund that helps simplify giving, but our team clearly shares these values, thinks about these values in a big tent, libertarian, conservative, evangelical, faith-based way, and wants to work with philanthropists who really want to have an impact towards these ideas, towards seeing a better America. And so, if you're working with another donor advised fund that doesn't share your values, well, you can get the same machinations with us, but you can layer on that donor intent for the values that we share. And we would invite you to go to donorstrust.org, learn more, reach out to us. We would love to talk to you, especially here at the end of the year.
And your podcast is Giving Ventures, and that's available wherever fine podcasts are sold?
That is correct. Anywhere you get a podcast, you can find Giving Ventures.
My guest,
and if you're specifically interested in the What is the Right series, you can go to whatistheright.com. We have them all right there.
Whatistheright.com. My guest today has been Peter Lipsett, Vice President at Donors Trust, host of the Giving Ventures podcast, and who has just finished up an 11-episode series on What is the Right. Peter, thanks so much for your time today.
Great to talk to you, Dan. Thank you.